Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. This week, I talked to another notable journalist that's left the profession, Mark Pitsch. Pitsch worked in the newspaper business for several decades, including a long run at the Wisconsin State Journal, where he served as a state capitol reporter and more recently, an assistant city editor. Throughout his career, Pitsch has been recognized for his work, including contributing to an investigation into the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation with reporters Matthew DeFore and Dee Hall. The investigation revealed that the agency gave unsecured loans to top donors to Governor Scott Walker's election campaign. Pitsch has also been part of newsroom teams that have been named finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage. I asked him about the response he got when he announced that he was leaving the newspaper business behind to take a communications job with the UW system.
Well, most of the people, expressed congratulations. There were a handful that where I kind of got the impression of sort of hey, how could you do this? Because I realized I had, because of my role as president of the Madison chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, I had been a, very public defender of journalism and an advocate for journalism. So there was a little bit of that too.
I also asked Pitsch, a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, about his brief stint working for The Onion, a satirical newspaper born in Madison in the late 80s. You just left the journalism business, the newspaper business. You got a new gig. How are you feeling about what you're doing right now?
I'm learning a lot. I'd spent about 30 years in journalism, and one subject matter that I've constantly had an intersection with has been higher education. And so I've always had a bit of a journalism junkie's interest in higher education, and was ready to make the transition. I'm a first-generation college graduate in my nuclear family, and higher education's been important in my life.
You did something I thought was wonderfully kind of nerdy and awesome when you left the newspaper business. On your Twitter account, you posted a picture of yourself, and you had -30-, which, if you don't know anything about journalism, that's kind of like, it means end of story, basically. So that maybe spoke to me, that it just said that, well, you really appreciated what you did. You kind of had this great appreciation for your profession, I would imagine. That's not really a question, but would that be accurate to say that you just you really love the fine details of journalism, practicing journalism?
Well, sure. Like I said, I'd been doing it for about 30 years. For people who have heard me tell this, I apologize, but I used to lay on the floor reading the newspaper, mostly sports and comics, when the newspaper was bigger than I was, and I'd put my elbows on the newsprint. And my mom actually, when I was 5 years old, had to buy me a special scrubbing brush for my elbows because they were filled with newsprint. I started something called the Cardinal Informer when I was in 8th grade. Journalism has kind of been in my blood, and so it's really been. It had been a part of me. And so I appreciate you recognizing, what that Twitter post meant and what it said. I think I always have and still do believe in the role of journalism in American democracy, and I'm still a believer.
So when you kind of made the announcement that you were leaving, and you talked to maybe your friends and your family, what were other people's reaction to the news?
Well, it was kind of interesting. Journalism is very much it's a very stressful job, and for my wife, she realized that it would now mean a less stressful mark around the house. But she was also, she also wanted to make sure that I was happy in doing what I loved. So she never wanted to push me out of journalism. In fact, she throughout my career has she'd just been terrific in terms of taking on, additional burdens to allow me to work weekends or to work till 7:30 at night, or, to stop what I'm doing, at 8:30 and take a phone call or log on to read a story or something like that. So when I think about reactions, that's the first one. There were certainly some people in the journalism world who, well, most of the people, expressed congratulations. There were a handful that where I kind of got the impression of sort of a, hey, how could you do this? Because I realized I had, because of my role as president of the Madison chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, I had been a, very public defender of journalism and an advocate for journalism. So there was a little bit of that too.
And what was kind of the decision-making process for you? Was it a long process? Did it take you a long while to make the decision? What was it going through your mind?
Well, I wouldn't say that it took me a long time to make a decision. I was not necessarily looking for a career change, but when an opportunity came up that I felt like I could, I guess, believe in, which is, work for the University of Wisconsin system in using the skills that I had in terms of, writing, analyzing, thinking about how to convey a story. It was sort of the right time for me. Putting out a daily newspaper, every day is a very intense job. When you're in the middle of it, you are, the adrenaline's going all the time and you're sort of excited about doing it. Now that I've left daily newspapers, it's interesting to see how everybody else lives their lives. I was mentioning to a friend the other day, do you know how many times in the last 12 years I left the office by 5 o'clock on a Friday without having previously made plans because I was going out of town? And I said the answer is probably about a half a dozen, once every 2 years. In my new job, I've been able to do it if I wanted to most Fridays. It's, the pacing is different. And that's it's been a challenge, frankly, to adapt to.
I want to ask you a little bit about something which just happened recently in Madison, which you probably would have been kind of at the forefront of, which was there was a shooting in Middleton. And I'm wondering so you were the assistant city editor at the State Journal. What would your role have been in a situation where that story drops, like it did a couple weeks ago?
It probably would have been in more of a support role to the city editor, Phil Brinkman. And you could probably say the same thing for the flooding. Might have been because I had worked on our big lakes package that ran in July and basically predicted what would happen in that flooding, in that kind of a scenario. Maybe during the flooding, I would have taken point on it. But, essentially at the State Journal, you had a city editor and a couple of assistant city editors who handled all of the day-to-day news. And if, as I imagine, Phil was kind of managing the news team, my role as assistant city editor would be more, like I said, in a support role. And that could be anything from providing advice and a consultation on what story angles to pursue, working with specific reporters who might be biting off this piece or that piece of a story. It might mean reading the main story, 6 times throughout the day as it evolves and as we update it on the website. Could be a wide variety of things.
And you've been at a couple points in your career, you've been part of a team that's been recognized for breaking news coverage nationally. Can you tell me what it's like to be in a newsroom when you talked about stress and adrenaline before? Can you tell me what it's like to be in the newsroom when a story like the shooting or the flood or whatever it is drops? And
you're referring to those Pulitzer Prize finalist nominations. Thanks for mentioning that. I don't know how else to describe it other than, your adrenaline does get flowing. You start immediately thinking about who can we get to the scene of the event. How many people do we have? How many people do we need? What are the angles on the story? The first one that you mentioned, involved a plane crash when I was working at the Louisville Courier-Journal in Kentucky. And so, I was on my way to church services with my family, and you get a call at 10 minutes to 10 saying, we think there's been a plane crash. What do you do? So what happens is, at that point, the editor tells me I've got to go here. The editor had dispatched 2 other reporters to 2 other locations, and we're just trying to find out as much information as possible. Then when the news conference gets called, somebody gets sent to the news conference where you're going to get updated information. When you find out, either from the news conference or from talking to eyewitnesses, what you learn, you're on the phone, you're calling it in to somebody who's at a desk, typically, being able to write a story that you're dictating by phone. That was a while back, so I'm kind of recollect, I know that's sort of pretty much what we did, but I'm, trying to recollect it. The other instance that you're talking about is, the Act 10 coverage. And again, that started with a handful, 200 teaching assistants from UW carrying Valentines up to the Capitol. So what happens when you start to see 200 people marching down State Street shouting? You find a reporter to send there. You find a photographer to send there. And of course, that story just built and built and built. And again, credit to Phil, who kind of oversaw that coverage. But you deploy the resources as much as you can. And, you're working long days and trying to provide as much information to your readers and answer as many questions as you think they have in your news stories.
What is the memory that you have of the Act 10 story? Obviously, a story that unfolded over a course of a month or so, maybe a little bit longer. What do you remember of that time?
In terms of like a specific sort of a newsroom memory, or
just when you think about that, what does your mind go to the most?
Well, one of the things I think about is a terrific photograph that we got from Mike King of the gavel being brought down by, I believe it's Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald at a joint House and Senate organizational meeting in which they were talking about sort of advancing the legislation that contained Act 10. Mike got this photograph that, is like, the gavel is like 1 or 2 inches from hitting the table, and it just, and Peter Barca is standing up being demonstrative, and it just captured the great moment, and one of many great moments journalistically during that protest. So that's one of the things I think of. I think of the front pages, Capitol chaos. Senate Democrats have gone to Illinois because they didn't want to provide a quorum to take a vote, in the big photograph with the headline Capitol chaos and the photograph of the empty Senate chamber. I remember getting phone calls in the newsroom from people angry about our coverage, or angry about the protesters and then taking it out on us, or angry about Scott Walker and taking it out on us, and having conversations with people. I recall being confronted in front of the newsroom by somebody at 7:30 in the morning for, because he was mad at us. So, so those are some of the things that come to mind. I also remember, just the enormity of trying to cover people who've taken over the Capitol and are sleeping there.
It's one of those few stories where, in a sense, you're competing with a lot of news organizations that you wouldn't be competing with on a normal basis. Like you're competing with the New York Times. So what was it like from that perspective to be the local source or the local newspaper on a national story?
That's really interesting, because you're so consumed in your own work that you're not worried about the competition, or at least I wasn't, because there is simply so much to do that you can't worry about what the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel is doing. Largest paper in the state. We were the second largest and always saw them as our main competitor. We knew those other national publications were coming into town. There's no way you can think about it. And there's so much news going around that, if there's a little bit that somebody else gets that you don't get, in many ways, it sort of doesn't matter. Now, having said that, I would stack up the State Journal's coverage against anybody's, and sure enough, the Pulitzer Prize jury would as well, since they found that they only named 2 or 3 finalists, and our paper was one of them. So
I want to talk to you a little bit about another story that you covered, which had some reverberations in state government, which was your coverage of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, which was pretty much a new entity at the time. There was some. Well, why don't you tell me the background of the story and just kind of tell me how it started? Where did like the first crumb of that story start?
All right, I'll try and remember, and maybe I'll remember a little bit as I kind of describe WEDC. WEDC was when Governor Walker came in, they essentially shut down the old Department of Commerce and created this new public-private Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. We had a couple of reporters on the state government team who had been writing a little bit about what WEDC was doing. And independently, I think they had gotten a couple of tips about the selection of grant awards for businesses. And I'm afraid I just can't remember exactly how it came about. But anyway, at a certain point, we realized we had 2 reporters kind of pursuing a couple of different stories about this loan program, and decided to get them to pool their resources and pursue a single story. And in the end, we ended up focusing on a $500,000 grant that had been awarded to a business that was kind of going under. And one of the key elements there was that the agency had not done proper underwriting. Essentially, if you're going to buy a house, the bank's going to make sure you're going to be able to make your payments back. If you're going to buy a car and you take out a loan, the bank's going to make sure that you can afford the payments. And in this case, it didn't appear that the state had done that work. And it turned out that as a result of the story, it was discovered that a couple dozen other loans that had gone out had not undergone that proper underwriting.
And what was kind of the outcome of the story, or what kind of results happened after the story got published?
Well, and again, it's an example of how journalism can sort of affect change and keep an eye out for the use of taxpayer dollars. Before the story even was published, Governor Walker ended the loan program. Ultimately, he restarted it, but not until, it was sort of a temporary halt. And then as a result of the investigation that the newspaper did, some additional checks and balances were put into place to make sure that when taxpayer dollars were being used to help spur some of these businesses, that they at least had been vetted in a way that they hadn't previously. And, I guess you haven't heard additional stories in the last few years about these loans gone bad.
Do you expect this story to pop up in this year's election at all?
Gosh, I don't know.
Do you feel like it publicly got as much attention as you might have thought it would get over the course of, through elections and at the time?
I don't know. I mean, at the same time, it got, it sparked a big newspaper war with the Journal Sentinel. They got in the game and they ended up breaking a story or two after that. I don't know. It was sometimes it's hard to understand how, it's hard for the public, I think, to grasp the impact of certain stories. It was a story. It wasn't a story where, you had poor people being, not getting services or something like that, or, so it might not have been a story that sort of touched a lot of people in their hearts or in their guts. So maybe it didn't get attention. It seemed to get a lot of attention, but maybe it could have gotten more. I don't know.
Is it hard to do stories like that for the State Journal? Is there enough resources internally for stories like that to pop up? Did you ever feel constrained at all during the process of it?
Well, surely, it's no secret that there are fewer and fewer reporters and editors in newspapers across the country, and that certainly held true for the Wisconsin State Journal. But I know that when I was there, and I know the editor, John Smalley, would always have said, when we have a big story like that, we're going to pursue it. And so what I've always told reporters, that you need to know your beats, and when you come across a story that you think is really important on your beat and can sell it to us the editors, we'll give you the time to go ahead and pursue it. If you simply say, I'm kind of curious about mental health care in the local hospitals, you're not going to get time to pursue that kind of story. But if you have the evidence that, say, there's not enough mental health, that, say the standard nationally is to have, 10 mental health counselors at every hospital for every 1,000 patients, but in Madison, there's only one. That might be the nugget that you need to have somebody pursue a story more diligently. So I'm rambling, but the answer to your question is, even at a time of fewer people in the newspaper, I never felt like we wouldn't pursue a good story if we came across them. I mean, just in the last couple of years, take a look at what the State Journal has done. We did a 5-part series on Madison Lakes. It was, there was a watchdog element to it, but it was, there were other parts to it as well. We did a 5-part series on gun violence in Madison. Both of those took a lot of time and effort. Before then, we did a 10-part series on homelessness in Madison. Again, sort of a year-long project. So, I can only speak for the State Journal, but I think the commitment is there to do big, important stories when we know we can pursue them.
We've kind of talked about some of the bigger stories that you covered in Wisconsin. Were there any other stories that had an impact on you just personally that maybe I wouldn't remember, or were there just standout stories that made an impact on you as a just human being?
Well, this wasn't a story in Wisconsin, but when I was working as a young reporter in Northern Virginia, I ended up sitting at the kitchen table with a family of a young student who had been stabbed to death. He was from Northern Virginia. He was down in Georgetown, the Georgetown section of Washington, D.C. He tried to break up a fight, and when he did that, somebody stabbed him. And, two things were really kind of remarkable about what happened. And I was in their home, 12 to 24 hours after they had learned about their son's death. One was just the look of devastation on the father's face. But the other was, the incredible grace that, the father and the rest of the family showed me at a time of intense personal pain. I saw that again when I was talking to people whose family members and loved ones died in that plane crash in Kentucky. 49 people died in that crash. And that is one thing that has always struck me as a reporter. People get this image of reporters as vultures, and sometimes you get this mob of 30 people standing outside of somebody's home, and I know what that looks like. But my experience has always been that the subjects of news articles are in times of sort of crisis and in times of sort of despair and devastation they're always filled with grace, and it's pretty amazing. It's an amazing experience to be with people at that time and see that kind of a response.
I've talked to a lot of journalists about situations like that where they've covered a death or whatever it may be, or breaking news situations where there's a lot of tragedy. And I imagine as an editor, at a certain point, you see a lot of reporters coming back from those stories. And I think sometimes reporters don't really decompress. Sometimes they have a story to report. Do you have any advice for young journalists or journalists just working right now, covering breaking news and traumatic things like that. Obviously, the trauma of the person that is experiencing whatever you're writing about is unquestionable. But like there's also a certain amount of witnessing trauma that impacts people. I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any grand thoughts on that. I would, I guess my advice to young reporters would simply be to sort of recognize the humanity in all situations and just be humble in those kind of situations. I've never been the kind of person that would, feel like, oh, how can, I can't go home and enjoy my family, or I can't go home and, and enjoy my life because of this other thing or this tragedy or whatever. I just think that, recognizing humanity is important. So
you went to school at the UW. What was journalism school like in the 80s when you were here? And what was your what was your expectation for your journalism career?
The journalism school was pretty academic oriented. It was not all that practical oriented. I remember one or two classes where writing news stories was the key, or being able to learn how to do layout was important. But a lot of the rest of it was history and theory, and I think that's kind of the way it was. Again, as a first generation college graduate, I didn't have a lot of expectations. I just wanted to go out and do the work. So I never really had a career path in mind. I didn't have journalism mentors. I didn't think 2 jobs ahead. I just kind of went out and did it.
One of the things that you haven't, when you were here at the UW, you ended up falling in with the folks at The Onion, did some humor column writing. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got into that and what it was like at the beginning there?
I must have been hilarious because because 2 of the founders of The Onion, who operated that newspaper out of an apartment on West Johnson, I can still picture it. It's painted white. It had a little front porch on it, gravel parking lot in the back. Had asked me to write a column, and to my knowledge, I was the only sort of regular byline humor columnist in the Onion's inaugural year. It was very sophomoric stuff, the kind of writing that you'd expect out of a 22-year-old, college kid. And then I got a job in real journalism. And as, again, people who've heard me tell this story, it'll be an old record, but I always say that it was the first of my many bad career moves, leaving fake journalism for real journalism. So I left, and The Onion went on to do great things.
Yeah. What do you remember? Maybe one of the columns that you wrote. Maybe anything that would stand out in your mind?
Nothing stands out. I mean, sure, I remember them. Am I embarrassed enough to discuss them? I don't know. I mean,
do you have them in a basement somewhere?
I've got
home?
4 copies in the basement. I tried to find them. I actually went on eBay one day to see if people were trying to sell them, to see how much they're worth. I finished my first one, and they said, "What do you want to call it?" I said, "I don't know. How about Catch the Pig?" They said, "That's hilarious. Great." I said, "Well, what if I do this?" And I drew a little pig figure, and they used that as sort of the column signature. So, I wrote one about how annoyed I was that teenagers used Library Mall to skateboard. I wrote one about math. I wrote one about Stevie Nicks and Paul Michael Glaser. I wrote a short play starring a guy named Eric and a guy named Longo. I mean, it was very much stream of consciousness stuff, or, they want the column in an hour. What do I do?
I mean, what did it feel like it was at that point? Is just were you just like, did you feel like it was just screwing around, or did you feel like there was a purpose or the Onion was trying to go somewhere? I mean, what was it like at the beginning? What was kind of the
Well, it felt to me very much like it was just screwing around. I mean, there were no grand designs on creating the Onion News Network.
right
in the fall of 1988 and the spring of 1989. Since I moved back to Madison, I've made it a mission to make sure that Chris Johnson and Tim Keck get credit for starting the Onion, and I think Chris and Tim will throw a couple of other names in there, but those are the two fellas that I stayed contact with. But they, as I understand it, sold it after the first year to Scott Dickers, who I also knew from the Daily Cardinal, and I think Scott was who kind of had the vision for it. But, in that first year, I think it was just goofing around, I don't know why Tim and Chris decided they wanted to, start a newspaper like that, but they did.
When you run across one of those guys from the old days, what kinds of stuff do you talk about? What do you...
Well, I don't stay in touch with them much, and although I've been in touch with Tim more than Chris. Both of them went on to start additional weeklies. I think Chris is in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Tim is in Seattle, and The Stranger, which Tim sort of ran in Seattle, won a Pulitzer a couple of years ago. So they've maintained, I think, some of that anti-mainstream newspaper vibe while still doing sort of hard-hitting stuff and culture.
In the era that we live in, which is of the Daily Show, of John Oliver, of comedians that do a lot of political humor, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the interplay between satire and journalism, and is there one?
So a couple thoughts. One, I don't pay money for television, so I don't see those cable shows. So it's hard for me to say for sure, but one of the things that kind of always frustrated me was, hearing people talk about John Oliver or who's that other dude that was doing it? John Stewart. John Stewart. Oh, it's more real. It's real. It's more real than a newspaper. Well, it sort of wasn't more real than a newspaper because everything that they were doing was being based on mainstream journalism. And so, for a while, that kind of thing kind of bugged me. And it bugs me now when people will complain about something not being covered or something being covered in this way. The whole foundation of what we know is more or less coming from mainstream journalism. Now, you see news sites on the left and news sites on the right who are doing their own original reporting, and in various ways they do it in a responsible or less responsible way, and every reader's got to decide what sources they trust. But anyway, so that bugged me for a while. I guess it doesn't bug me anymore. Is there an intersection between the media and satire? I suppose they're all proving the point that there is. So
I think some people, I'll put it like this. I think what John Oliver does is he basically, as you pointed out, uses mainstream journalism to make his point, but he makes the point maybe more crisply than maybe mainstream media does to a certain extent. Do you have an understanding of maybe news has to change in a way to connect better with people in a more sharper way?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I still have a belief in journalism trying to sort of maintain a neutrality, and that, you say that and then all the critics are like, what do they say? False equivalency. You're in favor of false equivalency. That's not what it means. It means a sort of assessing a situation, realizing that there may be, more than one valid point of view. Yeah, I don't know. Are we moving toward a society where people are only trusting media that kind of reinforces their own beliefs? Maybe. I don't know.
That kind of brings up in my mind, since you were the president of the SPJ in Madison, right? The chapter in Madison. I think one of the other kind of conversation points of media right now is diversity in media, and maybe especially in the Madison market. I know there's been a lot of conversation about are there enough people of color in Madison mainstream media? And I'm wondering if that was a topic of conversation with your colleagues at the SPJ or just within the newsroom at the State Journal. Were these things that you were thinking a lot about in the last couple, especially in the last couple of years?
Well, it was certainly something that was very apparent. There's no denying that. In terms of SPJ on the national level, it is one of the priorities. It was a challenge here in Madison, simply because, as you mentioned, the number of people of color in mainstream media are pretty low here, and through SPJ, we tried to reach out. We held training sessions on covering minority communities. I met with a couple of different representatives of journalism organizations focused on people of color, but those organizations were more or less inactive. And the reason they were inactive is they just did not have enough people here. And it's one of the issues a city like Madison faces. And it's one of the issues that the UW graduate or journalism school faces. The State Journal is not getting a ton of applicants from UW School of Journalism who are people of color. It's just the pool is very limited. And, for newspapers the size of the State Journal, it's sort of hard to sort of devote recruiting time all around the country when we have an opening. It's just, we do, but it's hard to sort of be more proactive, I guess.
Is there an answer to expanding somehow? How do you tackle the problem, if at all?
I think it starts at a younger age. Simpson Street Free Press, which both the State Journal and the Capital Times are supporting through the use of, space in our building and through the use of volunteer resources, is one place to start. I don't know how much schools are supporting student newspapers anymore. I don't know how much they're teaching media literacy anymore. But starting younger and making a large group of students interested in journalism, including students of color, I think would be a great thing. There are a lot of journalism opportunities right now, even if they're shrinking in terms of newspapers. And then building on that at the college level. I don't want to speak for people at the J school level, but I know that they know it's an issue as well because I've talked to them about it.
Did you ever feel like you had a blind spot in the newsroom because of maybe the lack of diversity at certain times?
Well, everybody brings their own sort of background to the way they approach a story. So I suppose, sure, it wasn't always easy to build trust at the State Journal in minority communities. But I think if you read Dean Moseman's work on gun violence, which is, was primarily focused on communities of color and young men, you'll see what a great job he did in building trust with those people who were the subjects of his article. So, I'll let you use the word blind spot. We'll say we recognize it, and it was in, How
did you end up in Madison? Where are you from originally, and kind of how did you get here?
Well, I grew up in La Crosse and went out to Washington, D.C. for my first reporting job. Ended up a couple of moves later in Kentucky working for the Louisville Courier-Journal, and then ultimately left the Courier-Journal to come work and cover state government at the State Journal.
What was it like you did it a couple of years working at the state capitol? What was that like? I know that can be a stressful job. It's a highly visible job. I think there's a lot of people start to know your name and who you are in a journalism job because you're working at the state capitol. What was that like for you?
Well, it was a little more of a challenge than I expected making the transition from Kentucky. I had a hard time getting used to working with 6 other people, including my competitors, in the Capitol newsroom. It just wasn't something that I was that I was used to down in Kentucky. The other challenge was, frankly, one of the things I was good at is writing about the daily news and trying to be as more comprehensive than the competitor, and then driving what we would call enterprise coverage, which is exclusives and stories that other people don't have. And I would drive that off the daily coverage. When I joined the State Journal at that time, they were not all that interested in a lot of the daily coverage. So it was all about finding the enterprise and the exclusives. And it was just a little bit more of a challenge because I didn't have the source base that I otherwise would have, were I sort of covering the big daily news events.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how you write a story? Say you're covering an assembly session or something like that, and they pass a piece of legislation. Can you explain how you write an article about a comprehensive piece of legislation and make it understandable to a general audience who, has no idea how the inside baseball of the state capitol works, and make it relevant to your readers?
Well, part of it starts well before the writing in terms of story choice. The legislature passes hundreds and hundreds of bills every year. Most of them don't get written about, and most of them don't have a huge impact on people's lives. So what you need to do is you need to try and find the stories that you think are going to have a big impact. So Legislator X wants to allow teachers to carry guns in schools. It's going to be a hot button topic. Or Legislator X wants to pull Wisconsin's participation in the Affordable Care Act. It's going to have a big impact on people. So that's kind of the first thing. And then you're simply looking for, ways to describe what happened. You're talking about like a daily news event, right? So you describe what happened and what it means, and you're trying to pack all that into either the first paragraph or at least the first couple. I think there are some simple questions that you ask. What's the story? What's the lead, which is your first paragraph? And what's your nut graph, which is typically your explanatory paragraph that comes in somewhere in the top 5 paragraphs of the story. And if you can answer those questions, then I think you can make it understandable to people.
Can you tell me about your worst day in journalism and your best day in journalism?
I guess I can't because nothing comes to mind. I guess I don't, maybe I don't think about my life and career in those terms.
Now that you've left the profession, are you hopeful for the future of newspapers, the future of journalism? What's your kind of take on where we're at and where we're going?
Yeah, I am. I think now is a time where people are starting to realize again how important newspapers are and how important credible information is to the health of our democracy. Do I always think newspaper companies are going to exist? Yes. Do I always think newspapers are going to exist? I don't know. In the form that you get that I like, which is a hard copy at the bottom of my driveway at 5:30 in the morning, I don't know. Newspaper companies are better positioned than your average blogger to continue to be successful in reporting in a credible, believable way. They simply have the resources that nobody else does. I think that at the same time, there are a lot of avenues. And this is what I tell young people when I talk to them. There may be fewer newspaper jobs, but look at all the other avenues that you have. Podcasting, video, web-only news organizations, niche publications, in addition to newspapers, radio, TV, whatever, the traditional legacy media. So yes, I'm, long way of saying I'm hopeful, and there's always going to be a need for journalism and journalists.
When young people ask me if they should get into journalism, I just tell them no. Just because if they want to be broke, if you don't want to be broke, then don't do it. But
I tell them yes.
Do you?
Because I also believe that you have to do what you love and do what you believe in, and if If you really love it and you really believe in it, then do it.
It was nice to get to spend some time with Mark. I haven't seen him in a number of years, and it was nice to catch up. I wish him many relaxed Friday evenings in his new job. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter @WisPodcast and on Facebook @The Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.